So let's talk about the difference between the OGL and a Creative Commons license, because we
Mm.
have talked a lot about, like, for instance, we have some games. We were talking about how to access rules in different games today on today's morning live stream. And for instance, Fate is licensable both under the OGL and Creative Commons license. I forget what, but one of the Creative Commons licenses. You had mentioned that you thought the Creative Commons licenses were particularly unsuitable for RPGs, if I remember, or on the other stream. Could you clarify that or explain why you may or may not want to use a Creative Commons license for an RPG?
Yeah, I don't think they're not suitable. I guess if I'd said that was I misspoke. I guess the way I'd rather describe it is they're not as suitable as the open game license, and that's for a couple of reasons. So one is the OGL is nice because up until last week or whatever, there's just the one, right? It has a unitary nature. There's one open game license, and that's it. So you don't sort of get into questions about, well, which open game license am I using? Like there has historically only been the one open game license. Creative Commons licenses, partly because of how successful they've been and the Creative Commons organization has been, there are lots and lots and lots of different versions of Creative Commons licenses. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. So one is, the last time I checked, I think they were at least up to 4.0 in terms of their sort of major iterations. So there have been lots of different iterations of the Creative Commons licenses, but the Creative Commons licenses are also a suite of licenses. There's optionality within Creative Commons licenses. There's different sort of modules of license that you can put together and tailor to your particular needs. So there are, like CC BY licenses, which are sort of the most open Creative Commons license, other than a CC0 license, which is even more open. But then it ranges all the way through to, Creative Commons, like share alike, non-commercial, non-derivative, which is quite a closed license ultimately. So it's not as, like, to say, well, I'm licensing it under Creative Commons, it's not as clear as saying, well, I'm licensing under the open game license, because to answer the question of, well, what kind of Creative Commons license, can take some work, right? Because you may have to go through different iterations of it. You may have to go through different modules. Like it's not as clean as the open game license is. The other thing I would sort of, that colors my view of Creative Commons licenses is in terms of their suitability for gaming, is the OGL was crafted for use in games, right? So it draws a really nice, workable, and efficient distinction between open game content and product identity. And that just, there's a little bit of magic to that mechanism. Like that works really nicely for games, role-playing games in particular, because it makes it easy for a publisher or a licensor to sit there and say, like, this stuff is open game content, it's OGC, this stuff is product identity. Like here are the different rules which apply to those two different things. It's, you can get to that same result using Creative Commons licenses. It's just tougher to do. It's not as neat from sort of like a drafting standpoint and from a publishing standpoint to draw a distinction between what is licensed on an open basis and what is not licensed on an open basis. People have used Creative Commons licenses for games and tons of other forms of expressive activity, and they've had great results with them. So I wouldn't sort of, if somebody's interested in licensing their games on an open basis, I wouldn't necessarily say I would steer them away from Creative Commons. I would just say, like, maybe you'd want to spend more time looking at the open game license. Like, I think it's a better fit for a game.
Well, we had exactly issues about those this morning when we were looking at how do we use some different RPGs if we want to use that material, the open gaming content, or open content. The open gaming license material with all its magic was very easy to understand because we've been learning a lot about the open gaming license. But then we did have some games that were Creative Commons, and then we ran into exactly that problem. Now, wait a minute, which one is this? Which one am I looking at? So that immediately created a barrier right there. I'm not saying an insurmountable barrier, but it was that all of a sudden there was that friction in that question that even Ryan Dancy was saying that I did not want that to be a part of the question. Just go to the open gaming license. And so when you're talking about that division between what the open gaming license calls the open content and the product identity, right, that's much harder to do under a Creative Commons license. So you would almost need to, so it seems to me then in that case, that would be the value of your equivalent to the SRD. You would have to basically publish an SRD and say that's Creative Commons.
Yeah, like exactly. Like, I mean, I think that's one way of doing it for sure. Although again, it leaves open the question of, okay, well, which Creative Commons license?
It still leaves open that question. It still leaves open that question. But it doesn't. It means that. But if you found a Creative Commons license that was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to do and license under. Well, okay. And if you publish your own SRD, it can work. It can do what you want it to do. But
and look, some people will say, look, no, that's exactly the power of the Creative Commons license, right? Is that it's customizable. Like I can tailor a Creative Commons license using the different modules in a way which works for what it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And that's a perfectly valid and fair observation. I mean, I guess like the downside of the OGL is it's a one size fits all thing, right? Like there aren't different versions of the OGL. There aren't different ways of kind of customizing the OGL. But that certainly is the case with Creative Commons licenses.